Hey folks, good afternoon. I'm Dustin Siggins with Proven Media Solutions. And today on Cracking the Comms Code, we're tackling how internal communications powers external stakeholder success. With me are Keith Berman, Director of Internal Communications for Vertafore, Jennifer George, SVP of Communications for the Aspen Group, and Andrew Moyer, Executive Vice President for Reputation Partners. Before we dive in, please don't forget to bring your questions and insights and experiences into the comments. We want to have a robust discussion today. Keith, Jennifer, Andrew, if you can please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Keith Berman. As you said, I'm the Director of Internal Comms at Vertafore. I will apologize up front if I look vaguely uncomfortable. I have a tiny dog who's passed out in my lap, fast asleep, and as everyone knows who has tiny dogs, they rule the house. Uh, I have a long and storied career in audience engagement. I started out as an FM rock radio DJ way back when. I worked in PR agencies for a while, worked in marketing agencies for a while. I spent a decade as a journalist, and now, for the last 13 or so years, I've been working in corporate communications with a focus on internal comms, worked everywhere from startups to Fortune 10 companies across a whole bunch of different industries, including consumer tech, health tech, healthcare, B2B SaaS, all kinds of fun things. So it's great to be here. Thanks for including me, Dustin.
I'm happy to go. Andrew Moyer, EVP and General Manager of Reputation Partners. We're a strategic communications firm based out of Chicago. I've been here in this role for a little over 6 years. Prior to that, I was at Edelman on the crisis and issues corporate reputation team, headed up public affairs for the Chicago market there as well for a number of years. Prior to that, my background was decade and a half or so in the public sector, campaigns and elections, worked for a couple of governors, worked in DC for a while, and was chief of staff here in Illinois for the Department of Commerce for a number of years as well. So happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. So many amazing voices on this call. I'm Jen. I'm currently head of comms at the Aspen Group, which, if you are not familiar, it's a large healthcare portfolio company based in Chicago as well. Aspen Dental, Clear Choice Dental Implants, another set of wonderful brands. I've also spent time at Unilever, Shutterfly, wonderful company, which is another portfolio company including Fiji Water, Palm Wonderful, and also spent the first decade plus of my career on the agency side. So have a great perspective on internal, external, and client service and in-house roles, which is always fun.
Well, and one of the things that I've said before on LinkedIn, and I'll say it again now, is, at my company, we're an agency. We work with clients. One of the key parts of our kickoff process, the very first call contract is signed, is creating processes for success. We ask for who are your subject matter experts and when can we interview them? When are they available? What is the key data for the campaign and proof that it's actually real? Who are the key internal people who create the smooth communications processes throughout the campaign? But the thing I've never done is work in corporate. And as I've watched, Keith and I, our first time meeting was 2 days ago, other than posting on LinkedIn. And it's been really interesting learning from Jen Becker and Jen, Keith, and all the other people on how the process I just described at a small agency level, just how much more difficult that is, but also how much more important it is when you're working in a much larger organization. And Keith, you had a really interesting story from our prep call the other day about how internal comms changed a bit as we went through COVID. I'd love to kick off the discussion with what changed 5 years ago thanks to COVID.
So, as most folks know, before COVID, it was you're in the office 5 days a week, no questions asked. So it was pretty easy to be able to foster culture and connection and get information out because everyone was in, if not one place, they were in concentrated places around. What COVID did was break that completely. And internal comms very quickly became a very important part of the cohesive glue of keeping companies together because at the time I was working for a company that had about 6 or 7 thousand people around the globe, and everyone was then working from their own bedrooms, living rooms, dining rooms, and we had to keep everyone engaged, everyone connected, and everyone focused even though the only methods that we had were reaching them individually and through the channels that we have, because honestly, we couldn't call everyone together. And this was almost 2 years of that. So, talking amongst other internal comms folks, that was kind of a very big turning point for the profession because we became very important, and the funnel by which all the executives were able to talk to their people pretty much within a few days. And even though it was expected to be, 2 weeks and we're back to the office, I mean, it took 2 years till everyone really started coming back. So we were very important for a while. Unfortunately, I think after COVID kind of ramped down and people started coming back to the office a little bit more, a lot of executives started to think of things as business as usual again and saying, okay, well, internal comms, that was nice that you stepped in the gap, but we're going to go back to the way things were. And so the pendulum swung and we started once again being on the line item slices when budget became a little bit tight because internal comms as a discipline can't always directly tie to ROI. It's very hard because we can't say, oh, we've got this many CPMs, or we had this many hits or this many impressions, and this tied directly to that much sales. Revenue for us and direct impact on a budget bottom line is kind of mushy. I've always referred to internal comms as a bit of a mushy discipline because our metrics are a little bit more along the lines of click rates and open rates and things like that, and things that we can tie to actions taken, but it's also a matter of, was this an action that someone took, or was this the way someone felt because they read our communication or saw a video we put out, or did they hear it from a coworker who saw our communication, or did they get it from their manager who saw our communication, or did they get it from a coworker who heard it from a coworker who heard it from a coworker who heard it from their manager? So the lines become really, really blurry. I'm cautiously optimistic that I think the pendulum is starting to swing back a little bit more now that we're seeing so much of an emphasis on authenticity and a lot more on having people, especially executives, come out as spokespeople for organizations, and especially with the generational shift towards a workforce being a little bit more populated by millennials and Gen Z and even Gen Alpha to some respect, where they place a lot of value on authenticity. They place a lot of value on seeing the people behind the corporate monolith. So hopefully that will swing the pendulum back towards, hey, internal comms really can help you not just tell a story, but also make you seem like an actual person and not just the faceless monolith of CEO sending message and speaking in execu speak as the Executron 5000 delivers messages. So it's it's definitely an opportunity for internal comms professionals to step in, and I think also being able to link a lot of things back to strategic elements is going to be important. One of the pain points that we often feel is we typically have to grab from a lot of different places and tie teams together, but also what we can do with all that is tie those initiatives and those messages back to an overarching corporate initiative, overarching corporate culture, and see how it all feeds together so that we can help engender that connection.
Jen, one of the things that a lot of people have on IC folks have told me, through LinkedIn and other conversations is there's often this, Keith described it the other day on our prep call as sort of tossing over the fence to each other. You're senior VP of communications. How do you make sure that those two teams work together? That there aren't silos and barriers to ensure that Keith's team is getting the right information for those external audiences to receive?
It's such a great question. I also want to just quickly respond to something Keith said because it's one of the nuances I've observed in my career anyways is and I've spent most of my career inside founder-led companies. And I think founders, at least something I've observed personally, but I think founders sometimes get something that not every corporate leader sees, which is like, internal comms is the engine of meaning. And
Mhm.
it is how a company explains to itself why it exists. And so often I hear from founders who have started a company from, let's call it a couple of people, maybe family members, and they've scaled it and grown it to, thousands and thousands of people, across the US or across the world, is internal comms creates that shared context. Shared context creates shared understanding, and that shared understanding, it just creates better business decisions, right? And the opposite is also true. And so I have found the best case study for internal comms and the importance of internal comms is is um is like when people don't understand the why, they just fill in the gaps, and those gaps become rumors and cynicism and reputational risk. And so whenever somebody says like, why invest in internal comms? Because if your own people don't know what the company stands for, the outside world definitely won't. So it's just such an interesting nuance, Keith, that you pointed out post COVID, because I think COVID was that case study, right, of why it's so important to invest in. I think for me, the biggest shift is particularly when you oversee both internal, external comms, is the idea that they are two separate planets, because they're not. They're the same story told from two different angles. And so when I run teams, I make that really explicit, and we do this here at Aspen, but certainly at Shutterfly and in other past worlds. If something is happening internally, the external team has to see it. If something is happening externally, the internal team has to understand the context, because employees are the first newsroom. Like reporters, investors, customers are the second. If those narratives drift apart, you're going to lose trust in both directions. And so the way I just from a like practical perspective, the way I sort of make it work is number one, it's always shared intel, like same truth base. If the external team is hearing a rumor in the market, like the internal team has to know, because we need to create comms guidance and talking points for leaders if they're getting questions from their teams about it. If employees are confused or anxious about something, external teams, are going to hear that too, because it will show up publicly within hours, right? Um, the second piece is always around sort of joint decision making on sensitive issues. I never ever let one side operate in the dark. If internal comms is saying, here's how this is going to land with employees, external comms is going to tell me this is how it's going to land with media, and we solve for both at the same time. And then I think the last piece is probably around having a single standard. If it is true internally, it must be defendable externally. And I think that rule alone helps prevent a lot of messes, right? Every leader has to understand that internal commentary, it will become external narrative. It just will.
If I can double down real quick on something you just said, Jen, like no employee wants to hear news about their company from the media. People want to know what's going on, and anything that happens internally will be reflected externally and vice versa. So, like you said, the water cooler talk and the rumors, like information flow is the best way to combat that. I often liken internal comms to the nervous system. Like if the brain, the executive function wants the hand to move, internal comms translates the neuron, sends the signal down to the
I
hand,
love
makes it
that,
move.
Keith. So
But
good.
well, and the other thing is that if the hand is feeling pain because the hand was put on an oven burner, that's good. Internal comms will bring the pain back up to the brain and say, "Hey, something's going on here. We've got to solve for that."
Yeah.
I think, Keith, that part is often the place that we have the most challenge. Sort of, if you're working with an organization that gets the value of internal, and I completely agree with both what you and Jen are saying about the case studies, that if your best advocates, the most trusted source of information, your employees aren't buying what you're trying to say, no one else is going to buy it either. But the place where we often run into the struggle, I'm glad you mentioned it, is it has to be that two-way conversation. You need those frontline folks to also be your key source of information, your key intelligence gatherer, whether it's rumor or speculation or challenges. If there's not a flow of information back the other way from the hand to the brain in your scenario, you're missing a critical component of the communications workflow there too.
For sure, for sure.
One of the things that a lot of people talk about, and I struggled with this when I went from the political world to the business world. I started the company with a tagline of "We put you in the press," and in politics, that generated a lot of revenue. Went into the business world, and people said, "Why? So we're going to put you in the press." Okay, why? What's my outcome? Well, you're getting in the. It took me 3 years to realize how to talk about this from a business perspective and how to start to drive toward the bottom line. With Keith, what you described about the internal, the lack of sort of hard metrics for internal comms, my understanding from that corporate perspective is there's a strong understanding that unhappy employees are less productive. Disengaged employees become unhappy employees. And it's cheaper to have an employee be happier and stay for 5 years than quit, have to hire, train, etc. How can internal comms make that argument better and then translate those successes into sort of maybe drumbeat press? The happy employees stayed for 5 years when the average was three, and those types of situations.
So shout out to Axios. They have in their, I think it's the 2025 report that they put out a few months ago, there is a graphic that they put in where they said businesses who invested in communications showed these percentages of engagement
Yes.
and business productivity. And they actually showed like companies that actively invested in communications showed the outcomes that you specifically just called out: productivity, engagement, better products, better innovation. The business impact of communications was palpable. However, and it was measurable in that respect because they also did companies that uh, didn't invest in communications, what their growth in those areas were, and it was significantly lower, like double-digit percentages. So while I can't specifically tie like my one communication to an action that everyone took, I think there are ways to be able to find those metrics. And especially in things like you pointed out, employee turnover and tenure, because engaged employees are more apt to stay for longer, and be more engaged and more productive. And the cost of replacing an employee is astronomical as plus the loss of productivity as you have that hole in your workforce. So it is a financial hit that you're taking if you keep turning over people because they don't feel engaged and informed. Things like, employee engagement surveys, you can typically sneak in a question or two about how connected do you feel to company strategy, how informed do you feel about company strategy and happenings, and kind of at that macro level that can help you with that. And it kind of dials into the more strategic portion of communications, not here is the process you must take in order to take this one job and do this one job. So I think there's ways around that, and also Axios also did another graphic where they talked about the loss of business revenue based on the time it takes to find information. So if you have
Oh,
somebody at a
yes.
particular income level who spends 10 minutes an hour looking for information, 10 minutes of an hour times how many hours per week times per year times their salary, how
Yes.
much of that time and money is lost because they're just aimlessly searching for information. So if you take that and then you go back to your intranet and you say, we need to rework the intranet, we need to make information more available, we need to rework our channels and make them more engaging so that people know what they need to do and when they need to do it and how they feel about the company and what we're doing and why, especially to Jen's point again about the why and knowing the reasons behind all this stuff, that can help you save money.
I also think, you know, we are in we are in the profession of meaning, right? Like, which is, helping people frame their understanding of why they're at work and find purpose in that. And it's such a privilege to be able to shape how our colleagues see the world and celebrate their achievements and all of that. The central question I always ask leaders, though, when it comes to internal comms, like, because I can share like numbers from external sources or HBR, all that. A lot of times it's like, yeah, that's great. That's great for another company, but show me how it's actually gonna, fix my problem. And so
Right.
the central question I always ask, a leader or a CEO or a partner is like, where do we need to take people from, and where do we need to get them to? And when colleagues and teams are aligned on their objectives or the challenges facing them, the scope for misunderstanding decreases. And so at the most basic level, right, the value that we add is in fostering shared understanding within a workplace or a team. And so if we do nothing else well, getting everybody on the same page immediately makes organizations work better and work more effective. And there's an example from a couple of years ago. When I was at Shutterfly, we built this like strategy scorecard because leaders at the time, they could not answer, they could not understand and articulate to their teams what the strategy was. They didn't understand the strategy. They were not clear on the role they were supposed to be driving in the organization. And this leader pulled me aside after a town hall and was like, Jen, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I don't understand the strategy here. Like, I don't know how my team fits into it. Um, this was a VP. It was a smart, capable, respected leader and still, kind of lost. So I think most people assume leaders magically absorb strategy through osmosis, and they just don't. And if anything, the higher up you go, the fewer people are willing to admit they're confused. So you can build, some kind of a scorecard, right? Or metric. What is the problem we're solving? What choices did we make here? What does this mean for your team? And then what does success look like? Maybe, it's going to be really hard to connect it back to revenue, but could it come back to how many people actually understand your strategy? How many people are driving this particular behavior? To me, I think once you actually have a shared understanding of what you're trying to move things forward, everything downstream gets easier.
And the thing that scares me about that situation is if that VP can't articulate what the strategy is, probably no one on that VP's team also can articulate it because they all filter up to that VP as a choke point. And if they can't, spin it back down and be like, here's how your individual team or role or department feeds into our strategy, that's a breakdown.
Yeah. I remember sitting around a table and I said, in your own words, what does everyone think the strategy is? And every person around that table gave a different answer. I mean, you should try it. You should try
Those
it.
exercises are fun and sometimes a
Fun
very
and
scary way.
terrifying.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Like so
fun and
scary.
terrifying.
But
But it's a great
profitable
way of
for
knowing where your
agencies.
gap is, right?
it absolutely does very quickly.
Andrew,
Because then also that's suddenly the CEO sees the problem. It's not an emotional thing, it's not an opinion, it's just evidence in the room.
And the good thing is it's a fixable problem.
Totally fixable. Exactly.
well, so how do agencies play in that, Andrew? We're talking to a prospect right now where they have been unhappy with agencies in the past that have said, well, you don't have anything to give us something better, rather than trying to be a partner and setting those processes in place. How do you try to either work directly with the IC folks or whoever your point of contact is to make sure that you're diving more deeply as an agency partner, as a strategic partner to pull those stories and those data pieces out?
I think the part of it there is the partnership. I mean, if you don't go in structuring it and planning for it to be a partnership, it's just not going to be successful. It can't be the agency going in and saying, "Well, you haven't given us anything, so we can't do anything for you." That's never going to work. I think the part of the partnership then is, we talked about budgets. We're back a little bit to where internal comms is maybe
Sure.
starting to be targeted in budget cuts again. The agency needs to be that extension of arms and legs often. That's just tactical execution. But part of the partnership is also helping them, what we were just saying, like identify the problem that is fixable first and the foundational problem that if you don't fix that, best comms down the road aren't going to change the fact that people can't tell the story consistently that you need them to tell. And so that might be an agency coming in with the right sort of, sometimes you just need a third party. And I feel this pain from a lot of our partners in internal comms where they will say this to their leadership multiple times, but they need the external person to say the exact same thing for
Totally.
it to feel valid. And so often there's just that you are the third party expert that brings sort of this expertise that can move things forward. And in partnership, then you find what is the process that's going to work for that team and where can you best fill in the gaps that they have.
Well, and also being able to see around corners. Like I think what you just said is so important. It's something I deeply value in my agency partners, being like bad cop in those conversations, but also because agency partners have such a beautiful, they've got such an array of clients, categories, industries that they're working on. They can see around corners with me and say things like, "Hey, here's what I'm hearing in the market. You should prepare your leaders before this becomes a thing for you." Like that's gold.
Yeah, and everyone is guilty of you get into your own bubble and you start to sort of you drink your own Kool-Aid, and that's a good thing. You want to be able to tell the story of the Kool-Aid as we've all been talking about, but that outside perspective, whether it's a new person coming in hired internally or an agency that's able to work with and see this is something that worked for this client in a totally different sector or industry, but have you thought about it? Those are incredibly valuable conversations that are beneficial both ways. It gives us on the agency stuff that we can also then bring to other clients too, which is incredibly valuable.
Yeah.
I think
Well, and Andrew, go ahead, Keith.
I was just going to say, I think that one of the good things about the partnership is that if agencies are able to bring those ideas to the internal comms team, then the internal comms team can tweak it and adjust it for culture. One of the
Mm.
one of the pain points that I've had with some agencies in the past is that they come in with a package and they're just like, here, deliver this. And it
Yeah.
didn't account for anything that was specific to the culture of the company where things were being rolled out. I think to Andrew's point of having that partnership, being able to work back and forth and take the feedback and being able to, on both sides, work towards something that will work for an individual client, individual customer, that's where the magic happens.
That is the secret sauce for sure.
And
We were,
adapting to the company's reality too, right? Like every company has its quirks. Like part of it is the like not an off-the-shelf package, but also you might have a founder with really strong instincts or like leaders who need a lot of coaching support before they get on a town hall or cultures that can carry some messages but not others. And so I think good partners don't fight the ecosystem. They help you operate smarter inside of it.
we got really lucky this year with a client. They were bringing together almost 20,000 teenagers and young adults to New Orleans, and they hadn't done PR in 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
Their marketing director had been there for I think 3 years, and they had never done comps, so they had no familiarity with this process. And we were brought in to kind of what can PR do for us was basically their approach. They had no knowledge of it.
Pressure, Dustin.
That was a curveball. Yeah, and we had a 1 month old at home.
Oh my gosh.
So, yeah, sleep deprivation was a real thing. But so the downside is a lot of extra work on the content creation. But because we were able to say that they were so willing to just introduce us to their state level leaders, and then we walked into Nebraska, one of their key states, for spreading the message around about what they were doing with this conference in New Orleans, and we thought this person was going to be one of their sort of non C-suite voices, and the local person said, no, 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 we got someone better. And they were absolutely right. And because national leadership was willing to make those introductions to those key, smart, basically internal comms for all intents and purposes here, we were able to take that woman who had been in a traumatic car accident and get her placed on at Fox News Digital in an op-ed on Father's Day about how her father saved her life after the traumatic car accident. That doesn't happen if leadership isn't the C-suite isn't saying to the marketing person, go. The marketing person doesn't say, what do you need from us? Makes those introductions, then we as the agency listen and key in on the right stories and then say, that's the nugget we can pull. It all has to work together. And that was sort of the first time I'd experienced what you guys are talking about, where in past, a lot of time people knew it, the funnel. In this case, they were totally ignorant. So it was a fascinating experience.
Hmm.
Yeah.
We've had a number of those sort of similar examples, stories that start internally, but without the right visibility, the right person to
Mhm.
say, oh, that's something that would be really relevant to, media or to, via an owned channel. We have a number of dentists and doctors in our both of our dental brands actually, who are former veterans. And one of our doctors, Dr. Gargano, he did this incredible patient transformation. Um, Gosh, it was probably back in like I don't know, maybe March or April. And it was such an incredible story of this uh, vet who is was a formerly unhoused individual, and he had this incredible story around how his life had been transformed since receiving free pro bono care from Dr. Gargano. All both vets both had this like really incredible story together, and it came from, a territory director who was like, hey, this is a really cool story. We should include it in this newsletter, internal newsletter. And then, in one of our editorial meetings, cross-functionally, an external comms person was like, oh, that'd be so interesting if we were able to get that out to like the local Kansas City community, which then, ended up becoming like an NPR piece. And it grew from there. And so I think being able to have eyes on the work that matters most for driving for reinforcing the message and the mission behind your brand, behind your business is so important. But also having the right, to your point, Dustin, the right eyes and the right um, visibility on the stories that are going to matter both for both audiences is critical.
Dr. Gargano sounds like he's going to be starring in the season finale of Stranger Things that comes out in January. Um, to that point, we talked a little bit about the division between internal and external comms, and Dustin, you used my expression of throwing things over the fence. It's interesting because I think a lot of those stories can really work when there is communication between internal and external and that meshing of just kind of the overall sense of journalism of, hey, we found a great story. We're going to promote it to our employees and to the world at large. But also it's kind of interesting where the situation that I'm currently in, I own internal communications, but I also own external employer brand. So those kinds of stories from the external comms team can also serve as an employer brand situation where you have leaders or you have impact made by the company. If you put those out there in the media or in, other places, it serves as a magnet because people will say, I want to work for that leader. I want to work for a company that does that. So being able to source those stories, and again, internal comms being the nervous system, having the ability to go into frontline places and have the connections and have the networks throughout the company to be able to dig out those nuggets and say, this is a great story. We need to tell this. We need to not just tell our employees about it, but we need to tell everyone about it and then use it in 16 different ways so that it hits all those different touch points. I think that's the most important thing. And that's one of the ways in which internal and external can really work together and really help each other create a cohesive message across everything.
Yeah, you think of how many times people pick your study. Is it six, seven, eight, 10 times someone has to hear something before they believe it or they start to remember it? The more channels you can use for people to hear that same story, you want it to be your neighbor at the grocery store saying the same thing you hear in a clip on TV of your CEO talking. Those are 2 times now that you're hearing the same thing in very different channels. To do that, you need to be identifying the right stories, the right storytellers for them, and then getting them placed in the right channels, both for internal and external audiences. And that, again, comes back to a partnership, whether it's internal in an agency or internal and external as a partnership. You really do need to be working in parallel and really in strong partnership to increase the impact and really give yourselves the best chance of a consistent narrative out there.
Yeah, I think a red flag in any organization is when internal and external don't sit together. Like, because those stories are going to be trapped in like a team meeting or in a Slack thread or sitting in somebody's camera roll. Like if they are not together, you are missing so much opportunity to turn stories into actual, business momentum and stronger reputation. It's the stuff competitors wish they had, but otherwise they die in somebody's inbox.
Yep.
So we have a couple of questions in the comments I want to bring to you all. And everyone else has more questions. Please bring them in. These two questions kind of go together. Laura, Jen wanted to ask the scorecard you talked about earlier. How did the company do that from a process perspective? And I'll add on top of that, when you ask around the room, do executives feel uncomfortable showing their ignorance in front of the C-suite, or do they feel empowered when you are the, let's say, the new SVP, or you're there's an agency partner doing that exercise? Does it give them more comfort in saying the leadership has brought this outside voice to try to fix problems?
Both really good questions. Um, the reason we built the strategy scorecard, at Shutterfly is because no exec wanted to be the one to raise their hand and say, I don't know what the strategy, right? They wanted, I think a lot of people you'll find, are going to interpret the strategy in their own way or fake it and hope no one notices. But you do notice, and you see it in meetings where everybody's like nodding
Mhm.
confidently along and then executing in 12 different directions. So I think, when we put, and this happened, this wasn't even a formal thing. This was just, happened to be in a senior executive meeting, and I think somebody was like, "Oh, everybody understands the strategy," and I was like, "Is that true? Are you sure?" And then we went around the room and, just said, like, if I had to ask everybody in this room to articulate the strategy, what would you say? Um, and I think half the room probably realized they weren't talking about the same company, right? Not because they weren't smart, but because, and so once we surfaced that, I think the whole energy changed. Now, I have also worked in organizations where, actually at the same organization, later, we actually brought somebody external in to host a series of like focus groups. And I think it was slightly different, right? Because number one, I couldn't scale myself. Now, maybe with AI I could, but at the time I couldn't scale myself to be in like 8,000 different meetings with different members of the organization. But we had an external person come in, host sort of anonymous focus groups so that we could actually understand like where were the gaps. Um, and so I think yeah, I think it can work both ways. For me, it just happened to be a really informal and I had also sort of built the trust of that team. And then on the strategy scorecard example, that was it sort of it was our way of forcing everyone into the same reality. So how we actually did it was we brought the entire leadership team together, and asked sort of each person, to answer in their own words, like, you know, what is our strategy, right? We collapsed the answers into basically like one shared truth. Here's the actual problem. These are the choices we're making. And then we started to sort of like pressure test it with employees. So we had a group of like employee advisory boards that we sort of tested it with. If this were your job, would you know what to do next? Like, does this make sense to you? What's unclear here? And then once we started building out like actual budgets and plans against each of the metrics that we were driving, we actually shared it on our intranet and our employee app, and we shared it on our monthly town hall so that people could actually see how we were mapping against each of those strategic directions. And became really clear where there were continued gaps, where we needed to double down on, and maybe where certain leaders needed to do a little bit more work.
What I really like about that is something we hear from a lot of clients. We talked a little bit about especially sort of generational change and the need for authenticity and belonging and impact is that transparency in communication,
Totally.
scorecards, and like, look, we 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 don't want to pretend we're perfect, so we're not going to just tell you that we're perfect. We're going to show you, but we're also going to tell you what we're trying to do to address it. And that's often where the gap is you've got folks that are willing to say we're not perfect and we're working on it, but they don't ever show you what they're doing or where they are in that journey. And the newer entrants to the workforce are more and more drawn to the places that are willing to be sort of candid and transparent and bring them along in that journey. And the visuals like that are a fantastic way to do that.
Yeah, and you can't fix what someone doesn't believe is broken.
Right.
Like, you've got a leader who says something once in a town hall and they're like, "Oh, everyone gets it." Or they say it to themselves a lot. And so they're like, "Oh, I understand it." Meanwhile, the org is like playing telephone with a message no one really understands. And that's the danger zone, is like you've got a confused leader creates a confused company, and a confused company moves really freaking slow.
Well, and a lot
Well,
of times the key person, and sorry, Keith, I just have a funny story to share, is it's often like in a small organization, it's not even usually the internal comp person. It's the person who runs the office.
Yeah.
It's the person who is seeing everything. And I have an example. My father's a serial entrepreneur, and he in his latest company is a gutter cleaning franchise company, and they were expanding that. They were doing really well, and my mother ran the office, and she noticed that one of their senior employees was a little bit grumpy. And he's kind of a grumpy guy anyway, but mom observed this and said, "Are you doing okay?" And he said, "Not really." She went to my father and his business partner and said, "Hey, go talk to that guy." And it turns out that guy thought he was underpaid. He knew logically that he was making more money year over year, but because they were hiring a lot of people, he was feeling overwhelmed that could this slow down for me? Could this become not enough money to take care of my family? And it wasn't the owners who noticed that because they're too busy with everything. It was that office person who essentially acts a lot of times in small organizations as that internal comms observer. Sorry, Keith.
well, I was just going to say to Jen's comments about the leader who kind of is not willing to fix anything that's broken or acknowledge anything that's broken. I worked for a rather large company where it, the CEO kept standing up in front of every single town hall and saying, "We have the best culture. We have the best culture," and not saying
You get to
anything.
decide
Well,
that.
yes, I'm so happy he just decided that and brought it out to everyone else. But
Must be
it was
true
interesting.
then.
Yeah, it's got to be true.
Yeah, well, yes, he said it, therefore it must be true. And there was that drinking the Kool-Aid. So there were a lot of people who believed it. And then for me coming in, I almost felt like Will Ferrell in Zoolander. Like, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. Like, are you seeing this? This is ridiculous. You're saying you have the best culture, and there are all these things that are broken and not working. And again, to the metaphor of the nervous system, like there was a distinct break there. And the brain and the hand were not operating in the same way, and so business definitely was not best in class. I keep going back to the book Good to Great, which was written like 40 years ago, but the principles still hold, man. I mean, and comms needs to
Yeah.
be, especially internal comms, needs to be the alignment between the brain and the hand and vice versa. You have to have leadership who is willing to invest in internal comms, to motivate and be transparent and be authentic and give the why and tie everything together. But you also need the brain to be able to accept input from the hand and say something's burning here, we need to pull back.
Which is also why you need truth tellers
Yes.
in comms, right? You need someone who has the courage um and bravery and ability to see through the smoke to say, hey, I this is a problem here, and I'm not going to be fearful or afraid, or I'm going to have to say some hard stuff to some senior folks right now, but that's my job, that is the responsibility, and quite honestly it's a privilege to be able to do that. But I think that's also where you build trust.
Except for the fact that there's a reason why the expression "don't shoot the messenger" exists.
I've been shot at but never killed.
And that would go to whether that is the best culture in that place or not, if that expression holds true.
Yes, for sure, for sure.
But if the CEO says it's a good culture, then the shooting must have been justified, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Well, the CEO said it's the best culture ever, so yeah.
Exactly. Um, Real quick, I want to put this question to all three of you from Doyle. Um, Internal comms has, in most cases, evolved from an HR bulletin and newsletter to a strategic lever. What's the one thing that you think most companies still get dead wrong about internal comms, and how would you fix it? And Andrew, let's start with you because I think the rest of us have kind of maybe a little more talking than you have.
what are you saying?
Because
Um,
I guess that's not offensive to me as
Wow.
it might be to the other two. I'll just let it alone.
I
Um,
mean, I think Keith yesterday said I should raise my hand and like start waving at him if he goes on to.
I'm gonna
no, I
pull that
think
knife out of my back right now.
I think it's kind of what you said. I think the biggest challenge right now is the places that still only view it as the newsletter producer or the uh part of HR that just serves for onboarding and sort of keeping people updated on like schedules and events. That is the biggest challenge and the biggest detriment to being the strategic lever that really can push a business forward, that really can be a net contributor to growth, to strategic goals, to the things that the company is wanting to achieve. And so without that strategic lever, you're just missing a limb, right? We'll go back to the central nervous system. It is an incredibly important part of a fully functioning entity to have that strategic lever functioning for internal communications.
I would also say, just to keep on the loquacious train here, I guess. Um, I think
A big word.
I think companies often still sort of obsess over what to say, but we don't spend enough time considering whether anyone understands it. And I think that's still a piece that companies still get wrong about internal comms, that it's not just the message or the distribution of the thing. It's, is anyone actually understanding it? Are people still confused about your strategy? Have I heard it, not just listened to someone talk? So I think, there's still a lack of kind of emphasis put on that understanding piece.
Yeah.
So I have 3 points. I'm going to do the second point first and the third point second, and then the first point last. Sorry, I'm just kidding. I do have 3 points actually. One is to kind of what Jen just said about internal comms being the messenger and just the channel. There's, I think, sometimes a perception of internal comms as just here, send this email and it'll be fine, and they can put their own words into it. What One of the superpowers that I always say that I bring as an internal communicator is I translate. So I made the joke earlier about, the Executron 5000 spouting off an execu speak. I'm sure as an internal communicator, every single person has sent in a draft for review and it's come back redlined with all the buzzwords put in and all the big expressions that mean absolutely nothing to a frontline worker. There is a distinct, and this is kind of segueing into my second part, that I think there's a lack of trust in internal comms as knowing our audience, knowing our stakeholders, and being able to speak to them in their own language, yet still communicating what the executives want to say. So I think being able to put trust in internal communicators to carry forth a message, to go in a little bit of an unconventional way to get your message across and be like, this may not be exactly the way that you want to say something, but trust me, it's going to resonate and your audience will feel good about this and will feel informed about it, even if we didn't use every single buzzword that you used in your last board meeting or whatever. I think the third point is, and again, I think every single internal communicator on the call will probably start nodding and smiling and being like, yes, yes. Um, we need to be in the room. We need to be in the room where it happens. And one of the reasons why is because as the central nervous system, we touch so many different organizations. We can see around the corners and we can see the issues that happen before other things blow up. And we can say, oh, these two teams are working on the exact same project and they're not talking to each other. Let's combine resources. Let's connect them. Let's make sure that they're strategically aligned so that we're not wasting resources. Or this team is working on something that is in direct opposition to what this team is working on. There's an issue here. We've got a conflict. These two teams need to talk. Other things like the CEO says, I've got this great idea. We're going to roll this out. The internal communicator needs to be able to be in the room and, to Jen's point about being able to speak truth to power, say, there's going to be an issue because of A, B, C, D, E, and kind of work it out and be able to take what the CEO wants and translate it into something workable, or maybe put the kibosh on it, or morph it into something that's a little bit more acceptable to how it'll roll out across the entire organization. So there's a lot there, but I often say you wouldn't go into the CFO's office and tell them, oh, hey, I think we need to redo the budget and let me play with your Excel spreadsheets. I don't understand why communicators are always put upon and say, we're going to reword this because I think this sounds better, or we're going to rewrite this for you or redo your campaign because this phrase just resonates better with me. It's not about you. It's not, we need to be trusted with our expertise to be able to take what people want and broadcast it out.
I
Here, here.
Hallelujah. And can I also just say to everyone on this call, like, stop being polite, like push your way into the room. But, Keith, you talked about being in the rooms where these decisions are made. If leaders don't think your function is important, if they don't think internal comms is important enough, that is your signal to push back harder. No one is coming to invite internal comms to the table. You earn your seat by showing how fast things break without you. So don't worry about, like, don't wait to be invited. Push your way in and make sure that your voice is heard.
And say no. I wrote a piece earlier
Yeah.
this year about how turning a strategic no into a yes. So, for example, we agency people are always having someone approach us who has a champagne, taste in a beer bottle, right? Or they were referred to us and it was a really bad referral. How do we let these people down in a way that, in some ways, PR is honestly not the best solution for their problem? We did that last year, and that group that I mentioned earlier that brought 20,000 people to New Orleans, we told them no the first time for the first project. And they were considering a couple of other agencies, and we know they didn't hire those agencies because we told them why they shouldn't hire anyone, including us. And then they came back later. I do think there's a reason to say no and literally say, okay, here are 5 things that I need to get done. Which one of these should be taken off in order to get your new thing done? Oh, you want all 6? Here are the resources I need. Say no, show why, show it how it meets the bottom line, and then make the case for those resources.
I have a full training I do for my teams on how to say no to stakeholders and partners because I think there is it is a skill, to your point, Dustin, to do it diplomatically and in a way that's going to, hopefully bring somebody back around. But I think sometimes it can be, daunting. You're hoping for a seat at that table, so you're waiting to be asked instead of, kind of standing in the power of your function and saying, no, I am a strategic advisor to this business, and I should be in that room. And by the way, I'm going to say no to the things that are not strategic drivers and that are, I'm not going to plan the holiday party, or I'm not going to, get swag for everybody at this leadership event. My job is to help advise on, X, Y, and Z. I think that's really important to stand in that truth.
And Jen, I love the fact that you're training your folks how to say no, because saying it diplomatically is so important, because otherwise you can be perceived as, well, you're just the person who says no. You stand in everyone's way. You're the
Yeah, you're the
roadblock. You're the
blocker. Yeah,
problem.
Yep.
yeah. And I'm going to
And
go around you and send that email anyways.
yeah, I mean, how many times do we have shadow communication groups start up in other parts of the organization because you were seen as saying no and you
Yeah,
stand in the way? So they're just going to go around you and do their own thing and get the message out on their own how they want to do it. So
exactly.
So I have to wrap up here, unfortunately, because this is a lot of fun. But I'd like one thing we talked about a little bit the other day on a prep call, but also earlier in this call was generational differences. And as my background is in political journalism, political blogging, back when you could make an income blogging, and what I've observed is that you're always going to tick off somebody. And a show we had a few months back, I forget the exact statistic that somebody brought up, that you're only going to have a certain percentage of your employees who are like fully engaged. And I don't know what those numbers typically are, was considered very good. But I'd like you all to kind of just close on how companies can, sometimes you're speaking to a boomer, you also have to speak to Gen Alpha, and not everyone's going to be happy. Someone's going to be wrong, upset you used the wrong word because you're too woke or you're too old fashioned. You can get an internal, someone at Amazon created weeks of messaging, bad messaging for Amazon during COVID, claiming that the company was violating the law and not treating the employees well and violating union laws. Created weeks of bad press from one person with a loud voice. I'd love you all to riff on both the internal side, but also how that turns into external communications when you're trying to navigate multi-generational communication in today's era. Easy question, I know.
Yeah. I mean, that one absolutely comes down to it has to be authentic to the company. And so you think of one of the other big things that changed coming out of COVID is sort of that, the pendulum. There was a action and a counter reaction to how publicly companies were coming out and taking stances on things. You think of sort of the 2, 3 years post COVID, every company had to come out and comment on every issue. And that was the expectation then. And now we've sort of seen the counteraction to that, and things are maybe starting to come back a little bit towards sort of an equilibrium point. But the ones that have managed through that the most effectively, they have communicated not to please everyone, but they've communicated in a way that remains true and authentic to the way they've communicated in the past. So if you look at Costco as one of those examples, their message today was the same it was 2 years ago, was the same it was 5 years ago pre-COVID. They stand for what they stand for, and they're not changing that. They may not say it quite as loudly and quite as many times, but the core message isn't changing. That is the only way to get through those things, because those generational changes, the societal expectations, the topics, the issues that are hot at any given moment are going to change 6 months later. I mean, right now they feel like they change 6 minutes later. So the only way to navigate through that, both in internal and external comms, is to just stay consistent and authentic to who the company is.
I couldn't agree
Go ahead,
more.
Jen.
I mean, oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think this was true pre-COVID. Not everyone sort of actioned it that way, but if you cannot tie your stance back to the business, it's not a stance. It's a performative statement. And so I would say, don't take a stance because a boomer or a Gen X wants you to. Take a stance because it's aligned to your business. And I think this is also, you said this at the beginning, Dustin, like you're always going to piss somebody off. That's also the cost of leading humans, not AI robots. Like this, I think the real skill in our work as communications professionals is in helping employees, stakeholders, regardless of the generation, understand the why behind decisions. It's not about getting universal approval. And I think psychological safety works at 25 and it works at 55. It doesn't, to me, there's no difference there. And it's the core truth that leaders don't always love hearing is that, again, if you can't tie that position back to the business, not your personal opinion, if you can't tie it back to the business, it is theater.
Two things that I want to comment on here. One is to the point of omnichannel and kind of hitting some of the different generations with the same message in different ways. When you have that ability to do it and you're not just pushing things out by email, you can use different media to target different generational groups, like, Gen X and above love email. So, you can be a certain way in email, and video tends to resonate better with millennials and Gen Z. So you can do things a little bit differently in video than you do in email or whatever. The other thing is having the ability to point to that, this is why we did it, to Jen's point. I've been putting in frameworks at a bunch of different companies that I've worked at about external events and whether or not we respond to them. Just kind of a simple yes, no flow chart about, does this impact the business? Is this going to impact our bottom line? Is this a notable figure in our industry? Are we just getting, or, do we have an interest group or an employee resource group that is part of this, impacted event or something like that? So I think being able to stay consistent in that way and being able to point to kind of a framework or a policy and just be like, well, we didn't comment on this because of this. We did comment because of that. That kind of consistency can help and can give someone a little bit of solace around, well, you didn't comment on my specific, left-handed painter's day. We didn't celebrate that because it doesn't fall into this side of the framework. But we did comment on something else because we've got an employee resource group that's very active in this area, and this impacts them because there was some kind of external event on it. So psychological safety does play in a lot there. And if you are vocally supporting a group of your employees through giving them employee resource groups or something like that, then yes, you can support them a little bit more vocally within the organization. But again, left-handed painters day, we don't have an employee interest group who are full of left-handed painters. So
Well, and also like a comment for what purpose? Like,
Right.
it's nice if you want to make a statement, but what are you actually doing?
Yeah.
Like, I don't really care that you have like a lovely statement that you're putting on X or whatever. Like, what are you actually doing to support this effort? And so often I saw this, a couple years ago, but also even more recently, right? It's like we want to put something out about X. Okay, the comms is the output. What is the input to this? What are you actually doing? What is the activity? What is the investment? What is the thing that you're doing to demonstrate support outside of just words on a status update?
What I like about what you just said, Keith, is it takes the narrative and goal and mission that is directed by the C-suite and it reacts, whether we should speak publicly on X, Y, Z, it reacts to the grassroots employees. I like how that in case that give and take because you said if employees aren't already engaged on it, then let's not engage because clearly it's off narrative from what employees are caring about. Did I understand what you were saying correctly, Keith?
Yes, to some extent. I mean, obviously, there's going to be groups that, for every segment of the population that they may experience something externally that, it's a horrific event, but we may not have an ERG for them or something like that. But I think that for the most part, there's a reason why people band together in certain demographics, and having existing company support in that area lends more credence to putting out a statement either internally or externally. But again, following the flow chart, following the guidelines and the guardrails that have been put into place are important so that you can still be consistent and making sure that because like you said, we're going to piss somebody off at some point, and being able to at least hold to consistency is good because then it defangs a little bit of it.
Well, we've run past our hour. This was great, folks. I really appreciate it. And Keith, again, it was nice to finally meet you after months of being connected on LinkedIn. Um, Listen, folks, enjoy your weekend. Stay probably warm. Most people in this country right now, I think, need to stay warm. And except for Jen. Jen, you said it's like 90 degrees where you are?
No, it's like 65.
Oh,
Oh,
please.
It's almost
That's not
90
even
degrees
starting.
warmer than here, it feels like. So that's,
I'm
it's
so
good.
sorry.
all right, folks. Listen, thanks for joining us, everybody. Really appreciate the conversation, the comments. Have a good night.
Thanks,
Take care.
Dustin.
Thank,
Thanks, everybody.
thank you.